Hello, everyone. This is Eric Pennington with the Spirit of EQ. Welcome to our webinar on EQ and the power of now. I'm not sure if I got that title exactly right, but we'll be able to see when I share my screen in the slides. But welcome and thank you for being here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we will begin. So this session, see, I've got the title right now. How can EQ lead to a better now? And tonight's session will unlock some secrets, some things that I've learned personally, and some insights from emotional intelligence, EQ, that can help you focus on leading a better now, which is vitally, vitally important. Very personal for me. So I would like you to think about it as I get my mode straight here. Sorry. Keep thinking that we're already in mode, so I apologize. This is a really powerful quote from a gentleman by the name of Joseph Contino. And I was having lunch with him and actually dinner, and we were talking about the idea of time passing, and we were somewhat being nostalgic about our kids getting older and how fast it seemed like the time it went. And he just looks at me really with great pause and then says, you know, Eric, life is just a series of nows. And he went on to say the importance of really holding on to those in that moment. Now, this idea of now and being here now is not foreign to maybe many of you, because it really kind of encapsulates the idea that ultimately we are in this place of better living when we can be here now, where we're not chained to our past or too fixated with the future. And I really, really found that quote to be life-changing for me, because it really set me on a path to really try to do all that I can to embrace what's happening now. So I thought what we would do is we would start with some basics around our emotional intelligence model with our partner 6 Seconds, just to kind of set the table a bit so that we can kind of have an understanding of some of the concepts a bit. As you can see, the idea around 6 Seconds definition is that emotional intelligence is that blending our thinking and feeling to make optimal decisions. And in the end, we know that the more optimal our decisions, the better our performance, the better our results. And in this case, the better we'll be able to be focused and living in the now. So the 6 Seconds EQ model is based on 3 basic concepts, and some of you on the webinar are familiar with this. The idea of the know, choose, and give. The first quadrant is rooted around the idea of know yourself, and the know yourself being basically your familiarity, your self-knowledge, right? I kind of liken it to you've watched your game film, kind of doing the sports approach. To choose yourself, which ultimately is what are you doing with that knowledge? And then the give yourself is that how is that being poured out into the world at large? And typically this is driven by some type of purpose, some type of calling that's much bigger than yourself. So as we look forward, and the model itself is made up of 8 competencies, and these competencies are, I won't go through each of them, but as you can see on the screen in the circle, things like recognizing patterns, optimism, develop empathy. All of these competencies are measured in the work that we do through data, as well as through ongoing work, development work. And you'll hear some of these terms as we go forward tonight that I think are key elements, some of them specific to the ability to have a more powerful now, the ability to live in the now better than maybe what you've done previously. So give you that snapshot, kind of give you some background. And as we move forward, I want to share with you a clip from a gentleman who wrote a book. Actually, he's written more than one book. The one I'm most familiar with is The Road Back to You by Ian Cron. He is very, very versed in the Enneagram personality modeling, personality typing. I find him to be very inspiring. He's got some great insights, and I really wanted you to kind of absorb a little bit around the idea of how self-knowledge plays into what we're talking about. So let's take a look.
Where did you first fall in love with this idea? And we can talk Enneagram and stuff like that, but when did you first fall in love with this idea of, what do you call it, self-discovery, or when did that start for you?
Well, I would give it a couple of words. One is self-knowledge, which is different than, let's say, self-awareness or self-discovery. Self-knowledge is really about learning about what are the hidden forces and invisible presences that are underneath the waterline of conscious awareness.
Okay.
But because they're underneath the waterline of conscious awareness, exert a tremendous amount of influence in our lives without our knowing it.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So this is why, let's say on a given day, you do something that's completely out of character, and you're like, I have no idea who that was.
Yeah.
And I would say, you're right.
Right.
There's the you that you know. There's the you that other people know.
Yeah.
There's the you that only you know.
Right.
And then there's the you nobody knows.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the you that nobody knows is the one that I'm often interested in helping people discover. Right? And what is it that forms that person? Because the more you can bring into conscious awareness in your life, the better off you're going to be, right? The more, or I should say, maybe the less autonomy those invisible presences have in your life, right? And the more capable you'll be of loving.
So that clip, as I show you this slide here, which I think is phenomenal, kind of illustrates that. What happens above the surface and what happens below the surface. Self-knowledge is really, really important in many respects, not only in the EQ model, but be outside of that in determining where you're at. Because ultimately, without that self-knowledge, it becomes really, really difficult to understand your direction and where you're heading. And the ability maybe to, again, potentially in the case of what we're talking about tonight, is the idea of slowing down to be in the now. So keep in mind, like this iceberg illustration, there's the behavior stuff. It's above the surface. Everyone can see that. It's very evident. And then below the surface are those things that are maybe some unconscious, maybe some that you've purposely kept away in certain environments. I've heard some people say, I act one way at home and one way at work, or I might act one way when I'm with family versus when I'm with a neighbor, those kind of things. But ultimately, you are you, right? So the sort of the motivation of where we're going tonight is, again, to try to get you to this place of understanding and maybe to kind of evaluate how much of the now are you living in. So let's start and kind of examine that a little further from this perspective in these couple of questions. So what place, when you consider your past, future, or now, do you spend the majority of your time, and why? And I'll unwrap that a little bit for you, in that ultimately our lives are made up of these three, right? There's the past, the things that we've experienced, been through, and moved on from. There's the future, which is that unknown, what's ahead of us potentially. And then there's the now, which is happening now, right? We're on this webinar. I'm speaking with you about this subject, and you might be fully tuned in, you might be distracted, you might be multitasking, you might be fully engaged and fully focused, but this is happening now. And I quite frankly believe this is the most important time you have, right? So when you think about that, I want you to process for a minute. Where does the majority of your time lie? And in a moment, we're going to kind of unwrap the three different areas a bit and their importance, their danger, the ups, the downs, the positive, the negative. And then after you've kind of had that self-exploration a bit, if you find yourself, you spend the majority of your time in the future, how is that future that you spend in in your mind, of course, how is that making your life better? I've always thought this is the greatest tool ever, right? That whenever you're involved in something, the ability to kind of measure it out from the perspective of how is it making my life better? Because indeed, if it is not making your life better, it's probably something you should stop. If it is, you're not sure if it's making your life better, then you probably ought to question it, really kind of evaluate. And if it is making your life better, it could be a good sign that you need to do more of it. So maybe as you're writing some of those thoughts down and kind of reflecting a bit, let's go ahead and unwrap some of the other as it relates to these three. So the first one we have is the past. You know, the past is very much like that old storefront, right? The one that has all these items that, you know, once we used and now we don't. It could be those experiences, right? The things that we went through, we did, and you can fill in the blanks here. It could be a blend of happy and sad. It might have been a wedding, could have been a graduation, it might have been the passing of a friend. All those different things lie in this place. There's some inherent dangers of the past. One of them is it is a place that can create paralysis. It's paralysis in the perspective that it's something that happened in the past that you replay over and over and over again, and it can grip you. I myself, through different pathways that I've taken from a business perspective, entrepreneurial specifically, I really suffered from this in a big way. And that suffering was that I replayed the mistakes. I replayed all of the moves that I didn't make. And in my head, I thought, if I would have made those, this would have happened. If I would have went that direction, that would have happened. And that's going to be one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute is regret. But ultimately, that paralysis is that it impedes your ability to see other options and other pathways that you can take. So there's paralysis. The other is nostalgia. It's an infatuation with all the great things that happened in the past. You might look at it and think of the time when you were in college. And it was great because your most formative friendships were made there. And it didn't seem like you had a ton of responsibility except for, you know, doing what was necessary from a school perspective, from your studies as you were advancing towards your degree. But it was a time that you never forget, and it just was a great time. And you can fill in the blank with other situations. But the problem with that is that we're in that place of ruminating. And the danger there is that you kind of are living there. You're using that as your comparison to the present that oftentimes you think is not as good. Which, by the way, the other downside of nostalgia is that we tend to overinflate the goodness of what that time was, when in reality, typically the things that we experienced in the past are never as good as we think they are now, if that makes sense. So the last one that I'd ask you to think about is regret, as I mentioned. It's that idea that somehow you've blown it, and there's no chance for recovery. And you replay that over and over in your mind. A lot of times that's rooted around your belief that that one mistake or those two mistakes, if they could have been reversed, would have led to a better outcome. And here's two things I'd like you to think about is that number one, you don't know that. You don't know if you would have made X decision and Y decision, it would have led to the outcome that you have in your head, because quite frankly, it's in your head. The other part about that is, and this comes into one of the competencies in our EQ model, and that is leveraging the idea of empathy. And typically empathy is thought of as what we give to others, but I'm speaking of self-empathy. That you have the ability to look back at your past mistakes, and ultimately, if you're still here today, you're on this webinar, if you're watching the recording, you probably deserve a little bit of a break. Now, I get it. if somebody's committed some heinous crime, done some major hurt to other people, I mean, I'm talking about you're the offender, maybe you'd say, okay, those people don't get that chance. But quite frankly, if you're a human being, everybody has a second chance, if you will. So I'm speaking of it in terms of, should you not give yourself a break? Should you not apply some self-empathy to what you're doing? I'm not trying to say you should excuse what you chose to do. I'm just saying, ultimately, it's in the past now. Maybe it's time to move on. Maybe there's a better way to recover, the better way to path to forgiveness, better path to making things right or doing things better. The one big positive about the past, though, is that it can teach us. That's the time I think that it can be powerful, and I think you should do it. Look back in your past to find some lessons and then apply them to where you're at now. That's absolutely one of the positives of the past, and I believe that's a gift of the past if we choose to go there. Next, we're going to look at the future. Future is there. I mean, we can kind of get a glimpse of it, but in many ways, it's got a little bit of fog, and it's got a curve that you may not necessarily know where it's going to lead, but it's sort of laid out before us, right? And as with the past, it has a negative and a positive side. The negative part is it can create arrogance. It's an overconfidence, right, of your time and what you will be doing and what you can do and how you're going to do it. And you may have it played out in your mind. And, you know, there's an old biblical theme that kind of goes, you know, you should probably not count the future because you don't have any idea about what's coming your way. I'm poorly paraphrasing that, but ultimately it's this idea that nobody knows the future. So it's much better to be humble about that and kind of take a perspective from that. The other thing is apathy. It's an approach that believes that the future is always miles away. Sometimes if you're younger, this can happen. You know, it's the belief that, you know, you have this endless reservoir of time. So if you waste a little bit, you know, hey, it's all right because there'll be more for me tomorrow. Again, this is kind of, in some ways, got a little bit of arrogance behind it, right? Because no one knows how much time they have to get done what they need to get done. So again, it does lull some people to be in a position of where they think they have time. This really plays out in a big way in our physical and mental health because we can ignore it because we believe that we can get to it later. Another danger is the idea of fear. And this one can be paralyzing just like the past, right? It can be that thing where you're constantly in a state of, I don't know what the future is going to bring. How do I know it's going to work out? What if this doesn't happen? What if that doesn't happen? And I've heard once before from many, many speakers and teachers, you know, this idea that what if is the two most dangerous words in our vocabulary, because it can lead you to a place of where you're basically living in fear of the future. You're living in fear of the unknown. And ultimately fear, it could have its acronym of false evidence appearing real. But again, the real part is you don't know. So as we shift to the positive, it really can be a place of preparation and positioning. Like you, I don't know what the future brings, but man, you know, good or bad, I'd certainly like to be in a position where I'm really well from a physical, mental, spiritual, emotional perspective, that maybe I've prepared to be the best I can be in all facets of life, so that if something really bad comes my way, I'll be stronger. If something really good comes my way, I'll be able to handle it with maturity. And I think that that's one of the powerful things that can come about the future. It's a very big positive. And now we come to the present. The beauty of now. And the now is a wonderful thing. And I should stop here for a moment, pause for a moment. This is my family, and they're a big part of my now. And the thing about the now is that it's interesting, it's elusive, because you've got sometimes the past pulling at you, the future pulling at you, at least in your head, and you sometimes can miss what's right in front of you. It's like it's a fragrance that is just, wow, it just continually flows, and you breathe it in. However, if you find yourself living in the past, if you find yourself preoccupied with the future, you will miss this. Now, there's a few emotional intelligence, EQ competencies that I'd like you to keep in mind that can be helpful in keeping you in the now. The first one is a noble goal. And that's one of the 8 competencies in our model. And it's finding this purpose, this bigger thing that you pursue. And from that perspective, what that basically means is that you found something that's bigger than yourself. I think Andy Stanley kind of likens it to the thing that breaks your heart is oftentimes what your noble goal is wrapped around. Now, some might say, well, then what does that have to do with keeping me in the now? It creates and fosters appreciation. It slows you down. It humbles you. It makes you realize that there is something bigger than me happening out there that I can be a part of. And then in turn, as you practice that, you'll begin to look at your family, you'll begin to look at your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, all with a bit more thankfulness and focus and heartfeltness, right? The other thing is optimism will keep you in the now. It's that belief that now is the best time. So again, whether you're on the webinar now tonight or whether you're watching the recording, the time you're giving to this is so powerful. And optimism tells me that I don't want to miss anything, because so much of life is so much a gift. And I get it. There's some really bad stuff that happens. But you know what's really interesting about all of what we're talking about? These are choices. You can choose to live in the past. You can choose to live in the future. And you can choose to live in the now. Again, it's totally up to you. It's a freedom of choice thing. Another thing is consequential thinking. I kind of liken this to when I think about my family, I think about it in terms of, I don't know how much time I have with them. And some of that, may be rooted about mortality. And some of it might be that, and my kids move on. They go to school in different states. They get a job in a different part of the country. They get married. They have kids. They live 1,000 miles away. That's going to be their life. So I want to appreciate now. And hopefully this is kind of resonating with you in that regard as well. Okay, how about we activate some of what we've learned here? So by way of review, we talked about the emotional intelligence model that we use and the competencies. And though I didn't say it so overtly in the beginning, those competencies will help you in living in the now. The idea, and I just noticed, I'm looking at it, I'm going, Galaxy 10, what does that matter? Okay, but anyway, that's okay. So as you look at this, we want to talk about it from leveraging some of those competencies. And if you want to learn more about those and how they play out and how we do the work we do, I'll give you that at the end. But the emotional intelligence, the EQ part is really, really important. The next thing that we kind of talked about was that self-knowledge thing, the video with Ian Cron and looking at that iceberg, the stuff that's above your behaviors and below the surface. The more self-knowledge we have, the better positioned we are along with our emotional intelligence. And then the 3 areas, right, of being in the past, being in the future, or being what I believe to be the most important, and that is being in the now, right now. So to activate a bit, let's go ahead and think about it from this perspective. Based on what you learned tonight, based on what you learned from the recording, what's one action step you could take today that would help you live in the now? And I want to stress to you, I highly, highly recommend that you make this a small thing. Don't jump to something that's ultra big. I'm not telling you how to live your life. I'm just saying, I've seen people who tackle that huge, big thing that they want to do, and it's too big for them, and they fail. And it really is disheartening for them. And they have a tendency they give up. So what I'm advocating is you take one action step that's small. Probably should have put that in the slide, but a small step you could take today that would help you live in the now. One suggestion might be, I'm going to give someone I love undivided attention for a minute. Now you might say, oh, I could give more. I could do 5 minutes. I could do 20 minutes. I know you probably could. But the idea here is that you're building in habit and behavior change. Maybe tomorrow it's not a minute, but it's 3 minutes. And the next day it's 5, and you build and you grow. Just as the suggestion goes. As we come to the end tonight, I wanted to thank you for joining us. And I wanted to obviously give you some contact information here that you can reach out to me directly if you'd like maybe to fill in some blanks that maybe you had. You can visit our website as well. There are some areas that are not listed here in the sense of, the contact, and that we do have a wonderful podcast, the Spirit of EQ podcast. If you go on to Apple Podcast or the Google platform and just do a search under Spirit of EQ, we'll come up. You can subscribe and download and all that. And then we also have a YouTube channel, which is where we house a lot of the video content that we've created. There's some webinars on there from past. There's some small, quick videos that I've done. But again, all to spur you on. And then, of course, the social media places like LinkedIn and Facebook, and we're there as well. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight, and I thank you for joining us. And we look forward to the next time when we'll be together. And I hope you have a great evening. Take care.